Hello, and welcome to another edition of Champion Briefs video topic analysis. Welcome to the first topic of the 22-23 debate season, where we're going to be discussing resolve. The United States ought to implement a single-payer universal healthcare system. Today, I'm joined by Adam Tomasi, and I guess to start on this topic, there are a couple of interesting nuances between different forms of healthcare. The topic asks for specifically a single payer universal healthcare system, which is different than just universal healthcare system in general. Adam, you want to go into maybe some of the nuances between a single payer versus single payer universal healthcare?
Of course. So, first of all, thank you, Daniel, for inviting me on. And to define single payer and compare that to universal healthcare more broadly, what single payer means is that the government, the state, is the sole bill payer for healthcare services. So instead of private health insurance, typically, the government would be the one whom all of the medical care is billed to, and that is paid for by taxpayer dollars. Within single payer systems, you typically get the ability to purchase supplemental private health insurance for certain services. So when Canadian Medicare was founded as a single payer system, and it's called Medicare, just like American Medicare, that for us is just for people 65 plus, it did not cover dental or vision or prescriptions, and it still doesn't. So people typically have to purchase supplemental insurance for those services. But when it comes to emergency care and elective surgeries, like as much as people will make a hullabaloo about the wait times, like that medical care is free at the point of service, meaning that rather than the individual having to pay for their health care via a private insurance policy, when you go to the hospital, you don't get a bill typically, or at all, but in terms of universal healthcare more broadly, it is theoretically possible to have a universal multi-payer system. So in terms of countries like Germany, where they have like very intense competition between hundreds of private nonprofit sickness funds that people make contributions into, or you have other places like the Netherlands, for instance, that have, or even Germany as well, that have like a very strict individual mandate for health insurance. So if you think about the individual mandate under Obamacare, which has since been gutted, in other countries that have a private health insurance system, their individual mandate is very robust. So very strict penalty for not purchasing private health insurance, and there's a lot more competition among private insurers. So it's universal and private, but in the American system, it's private and absolutely not universal at all. And so that's where the single payer, controversy comes to the forefront.
I think that was a really good delineation there between the different systems. You also kind of hint, I think, at some strategies that could be used. So we'll get into that in a minute. But I think the other thing that's important to talk about is that, the topic is specific to the United States. So the United States healthcare system is unique, let's put it that way, in a lot of comparison to, some of the other countries that would be considered, are equal, or even countries that are not necessarily as economically successful as we are, have substantially more healthcare provided for their citizens. So when we start to look at U.S. healthcare, there seems to be kind of two different and distinct problems to it. The first is cost, right? It costs people a lot of money, whether they have insurance or not. Then the second would be access. In my mind, I feel like the topic tries to address access, but really only addresses cost. What do you think?
Yeah, so there's this interesting mantra among certain healthcare reform experts, which you definitely shouldn't take as like an objective truth, because I think usually people deploy this mantra to say that single payer is not going to work. So this is coming from the more like moderate, voices around healthcare reform, like the people that like designed the Affordable Care Act. And they say that there's like a triangle of like costs, quality, and access. And you can only satisfy two of those and not all three. So if you're trying to define, or if you're trying to create like a good healthcare system, you have to prioritize two and sacrifice the other a little bit. So you could have like very high quality, great access, but it's really expensive. Or like access, like universal access, really affordable, but it might be low quality. The thing is, though, there are a lot of great AF cards, whether they're about the UK's National Health Service, or they're about Canada, or other countries with single payer systems, that show that we can have it all when it comes to cost, quality, and access. I'll note two more things as well when it comes to comparing the US with other countries. First is that technically the UK's NHS is socialized medicine and not single payer per se. Like it's like single payer plus, because in the UK, the government also owns and operates the hospitals. Whereas with single payer in the US, you would have public billing, but private provision largely. So the like single payer system in the US would not abolish like investor owned hospitals. Like there'd still be plenty of private companies involved in healthcare. So you might even as the AF be able to say like, I don't deck innovation relative to the UK because the AF is not fully public. I mean, I'm not saying the NHS is like objectively bad. This is just, putting arguments out here into the forefront. There are a lot of good things going for it, but as the AF, you can make that pivot. One other thing too, is if you're the neg and you're arguing for the pharma DA, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit more, I'm sure, you can say that comparing the US to other countries, the reason why drugs are more expensive here, the big pharma people argue, is that indirectly subsidizes the cheap drugs elsewhere. So they're like, yeah, drugs are super affordable in other countries, but, it's American innovation funded by high costs here that makes it possible for other places to keep prices so low. So they'll say that's the devil's bargain.
Yeah. So I think you kind of showed two different ways there that the AF has to kind of implement the an option for single payer. And I think it's good to focus actually on the word implement for a second. It almost seems like the resolution is saying that we have to provide some form of a plan. Because it's talking about implementation specifically within their resolution, we can't just talk about, I think, single payer as a good idea within the healthcare system. There needs to be whether some form of actual implementation, debating about the implementation, which is a unique aspect within LD. So affirmatives that usually would try to spike out of that implementation question, how should they deal with it on this topic?
Yeah, I think that there would be a lot of really compelling affirmatives that are non-utilitarian that you'll find in the champion briefs as well, that say quite simply, healthcare is a human right. Ergo, everyone deserves it. It's a right, not a privilege. So it's the state's responsibility to provide universal healthcare. And they could say, I'm arguing for the principle that healthcare is a human right, so I don't have to get into the ticky-tacky details of wait times, rationing, drug prices, all this other stuff. I think the neg can make a valid argument that if single payer creates barriers to access in some way, that's counterproductive for healthcare being a human right. Like you do have to prove you achieve access in a successful, effective way, or else like that human right, it becomes an empty promise. But I think the AF might be able to say that the like infrastructure for universal healthcare is a moral requirement, even if it's not perfect, because like countries like Canada or the UK, they try to build upon the systems they already have. Like it's not like they're looking at this problem of like, the instances where you hear about the horror stories of people like dying, because they had to wait in line. Like these countries are trying to like fix the like problems that come up, in like managing this public system. So they don't say, because some issues, some snags came up, we're just going to go to a fully private system. Like, their goal is to build upon the foundation they've already set. So you could say,
How unique of a form of governance to fix things instead of just getting rid of them if they don't work.
Right. So yeah, you could say that too with a non-util AF, like wait times, rationing, and other solvency deficits don't answer the AF because the alternative is not recognizing healthcare as a human right at all. So do that first and then build on it.
I think that makes sense in a lot of ways. So let's kind of get into some of those AF arguments. My own research, I discovered that access a lot of times can be determined based upon identity. There are a lot of identity-based issues with access, whether it's LGBTQ access, as well as quality care with that, as well as minority access, women access for women in healthcare. So there seems to be a lot of different access issues that can be specific towards one identity. Would you think that a more generalized case dealing with all of these access issues is good, or is a more specific case that's like one issue kind of strategic on the topic?
I think that the AF wants to have both kinds of cases in the toolbox, where I think that you want to make sure when you're AF that you are able to have contentions that can engage with some of the more valid criticisms of single payer in other countries, like Canada, for instance, has had major issues delivering equitable healthcare to First Nation people, even though they have single payer, presumably universal healthcare. First Nations have been shafted by government mismanagement. So you would have to make sure that you have like an AF narrative that can compellingly speak to how single payer can benefit Indigenous people, for instance. So maybe how American single payer would end up fully funding the Indian Health Service, the IHS, which is an extant federal program that does like benefit a lot of Native Americans now. Like, it's one of the few bright spots in the US government's relationship to Native people, but there are still problems with it that can be, fixed with single payer. Similarly, when it comes to Black Americans, I think where the neg will have valid arguments about doctor bias, ascribing inaccurately a higher pain tolerance to Black patients, or like the disproportionately higher rates of maternal mortality for Black women, I think the AF would be able to emphasize and should be prepared to talk about how the high rates of uninsurance in marginalized communities create disparities that the AF is uniquely able to rectify, and maybe the relationship of that to more deep-rooted issues of like denial of services by doctors, other forms of endemic racial bias. So I think the AF needs to look at the way that advocacy groups for different marginalized communities put universal healthcare on the table, to make sure you have that breadth and depth and different ACs in the toolbox.
Yeah, and I think kind of on the flip side, negatives definitely have a lot of ground to talk about why the healthcare system just in general is flawed, and fixing access really doesn't solve some of the larger systemic issues. You had mentioned, doctor bias that goes beyond, multiple different populations face different forms of doctor bias, whether it's refusing to treat patients who may have had, HIV/AIDS, or refusing to provide gender affirming care, or even just in the research on how like medicines are produced and how different techniques are developed for surgeries and stuff like that, are often done through a biased mechanism that favors usually like white cisgendered male. And so the research does not necessarily like actually reflect what different populations are going through, how medicines interact with people, with different peoples. And so there are a lot of different ways that the negative can also go about addressing identity within the healthcare industry and the problems that are faced. And just saying, hey, you have access to it doesn't necessarily mean the system itself that you now have access to is a good system. And so there could be a question about whether or not that may actually increase forms of potential violence and stuff like that, and be a harm to different populations.
Right.
Um,
And one additional aspect to that is the relationship of single payer to the Hyde Amendment, which is going to be an important discussion with Roe v. Wade having been overturned, because the Hyde Amendment prohibits federal funding for abortions. So would single payer in the American political environment actually entail adequate funding for reproductive health care? The AF could fiat that they repeal the Hyde Amendment in the process of establishing single payer, though the NEG might be able to argue that's extra topical. So you could say that that goes beyond the scope of the topic. I mean, the AF can also say, because abortion is healthcare, that it is part of, universal healthcare. But that is an interesting debate as well. Like if the AF doesn't speak to that, the NEG can say, no takebacks. They didn't say they repealed the Hyde Amendment. Normal means is that they would leave it in place, because single payer wouldn't get the votes in a normal means scenario unless that compromise was made to say single payer except for the provision of abortions, which might leave a lot of systemic barriers intact.
I mean, let's be honest, single payer under our current system, under any kind of guise, probably wouldn't pass Hyde Amendment or no. Our current political system probably is anti, a universal healthcare system. Speaking of, I guess politics is always a big issue, and we have midterms coming up basically at the end of this topic period. Uh, my first gut reaction is that single payer probably would help Democrats somehow in the midterms, because it would push turnout from people who, younger progressives, all the different populations who would have it, really have been supporting single payer healthcare for a while. There's probably environmental scenarios that would go along with midterms and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on a good midterms politics scenario?
Yeah, I'm thinking that it might be creative for the NEG to write the Dems bad DA. So to say single payer would give Biden and Democrats in precarious races like an enormous second wind that would push them over the edge in terms of like restoring the Democrats' legitimacy. And consequently, that would mean that we wouldn't have the GOP taking back one or both houses. And you could read a scenario about like being tough on China. Like you could say like the Republicans winning the midterms is key to more aggressively confronting Chinese expansionism. And you could have a nuclear war impact to that. You could make like, I know there's like an econ argument about how like the stock market prefers to have like division with like a president from one party and like Congress dominated by the opposite, because like Wall Street prefers gridlock, because they're like, so long as nothing gets done, we make more money. Like I have seen that evidence, right? So you could say it's key to the stock market and like investor confidence. But then with like the Dems good DAs, you were saying it could be like single payer is such a lightning rod that like moderate Democrats, like with the precarious 50-50 split in the Senate now, that single payer passing might mean that like, Democrats in these like red states get taken under. And then you have a narrow Republican majority. You could say that guts Biden's agenda on climate change extinction.
Yeah. So yeah, there definitely are scenarios on both sides. Love all that Wall Street argument that Wall Street wants nothing to happen. Makes sense. Um, but thinking of Wall Street, there's probably a lot of economic impacts on both sides. My first thought whenever I hear of socialized medicine or a single payer healthcare in any way is that there's probably some strike back against the capitalist state involved in that. So on the AF side, there's very obviously, neoliberalism cases, anti-cap cases, neg side spending DA. My feeling is it's probably a core of the topic argument. that will be out there a lot. Um, I don't know what you're thinking on capitalism. I know it's a tired argument to some extent because people run cap bad on every topic, but I feel like on this topic, it's like, yeah, maybe there's a good link to this. Um,
Yeah, I think that single payer strikes at the core of a for-profit healthcare system. And I think that having publicly run healthcare would put need above profit in a way that would go against a more neoliberal current in healthcare, which you could say the ACA was like the apotheosis of. But then I would also add that in terms of the economic impacts that the neg could focus on, where it's almost like single payer striking at capitalism by functionally abolishing the private insurance industry. The neg could say that the job losses from that might have economic repercussions, where one of the reasons why like single payer is antithetical to a for-profit private insurance system is because it simplifies the billing process. So instead of having a bunch of private insurers that hospitals have to hire like an entire group of people whose full-time job is managing all the billing, like matching the person to their insurer, and you have a bunch of them, and you have to figure out what services are approved and what are denied, the job becomes a lot simpler because the one bill payer becomes Medicare, it becomes the federal government. So that means you need a lot less people doing that job. So you might see mass layoffs in the billing and claims departments.
You also would see probably insurance companies shut down or significantly decrease their operations. And, if especially if we go to like a Canada-like system, yeah, they may still exist, but way less than they probably would in, the status quo.
Yeah. And what's also really interesting too is that a lot of private health insurance companies invest in other companies. Like they're kind of like pseudo hedge funds that way. Like they also invest plenty of their money in portfolios elsewhere. So what are the ramifications of those companies going under for those investments? So the AF could indicate that like the AF would really be like a systemic change that eliminates the predominance of capitalism in one sector of our lives. Like the expansion of the market into more and more areas of our lives is like the essence of neoliberalism, compared to just having a market in general. Whereas the neg could say that's precisely the econ link.
Yeah. So like the neg would basically be like cap good almost, but like even if the neg wants to kind of concede, yeah, cap may be bad, this deconstruction of our whole economic system would be even worse. I guess even kind of further on this kind of critical look at the healthcare industry, we talk about the government being in control of healthcare, and that always brings up biopower flags in my brain of, government controlling our information. I think biopower on any topic probably has some link, but to me, this is where Foucault was like, this is what he was talking about. This was his problem actually when it came to like socialized institutions, was you give the government control over things like healthcare, we can start to otherize people. So like beyond biopower, which I think is a great K, is there anything else on this topic that like screams, hey, this probably has some critical analysis that we need to look at?
Yeah, I'm thinking that there could be an excellent critique of there's like this one book by this guy like Ivan Illich, who wrote this book that like critiqued the doctor-patient relationship and medical experts, and like that's kind of wacky though, and that gets into some like anti-vaxxer territory probably and all sorts of things like that. But there are critiques of the medical system that way. There's a whole book by Harriet Washington called Medical Apartheid, which focuses on what you had mentioned earlier about the like anti-Black medical experiments. Whether we're looking at the Tuskegee syphilis experiments or with Henrietta Lacks and her genetic information being robbed from her in order to produce all of these life-saving medical innovations, and her family not being given any reparations despite decades of legal fights to achieve that. And you could say that that would be endemic to the AF's reform. It's interesting because the AF, I think it's in your best interest to say that single payer really is like systematic structural change. Whereas I think it's in the neg's interest with NEK, even if you're reading CAP on the neg, to say that the AF is just tinkering with an overarching oppressive system.
Yeah, especially I think on the neg, if affirmatives leave some form of like profit within the healthcare industry, i.e., private providers, there's probably some question over whether this is just some form of band-aid to preserve a marketplace and stuff like that, and make a marketplace more, human, but still keep the marketplace involved. So
yeah, there
there's
was another
definitely
interesting K that reminded me of. So I had debated single payer as a college policy resolution, and there was a really cool critique that we lost to when we were AF, and it was a critique of the cost efficiency logic that underlied a lot of the AF's advantages for single payer, like the extent that single payer would be a lot more efficient than private insurance at like keeping healthcare costs low, like the minimum necessary expenses to run like a proper healthcare system. The neg said that that cost efficiency logic was like capitalism par excellence, and they had this interesting analogy, which was like, you don't try to make like a symphony more efficient, and like I didn't think that that made a lot of sense in the context of like a healthcare system that's first and foremost about saving lives, but the judge really liked it, right? So I think that you could have a K of certain underlying logics behind single payer, like the cost efficiency piece.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at the topic that I didn't think of before. Um, I think the other thing to note on the topic is that this is not one that can be very tricky. It is, it's a very straightforward topic on what it is asking us to evaluate. But in some ways, that leaves the neg open to a lot of different counterplan options. I think we hinted at a few of them throughout this, like having some form of a mandate without having actually government payment. There are other mandate ways you can do it, like expanding private health insurance. Forcing basically private employers to provide insurance, expanding Medicaid options in parallel with some of those things to try to cover all populations.
Yeah,
I
one of the
guess.
best. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask you, I guess, what are you thinking advantage counterplan wise, or even just process counterplan wise?
I think that one of the best counterplans would be the public option. So, of course, the premise of the public option is that you would make Medicare something that anybody could buy into, regardless of whether you're a senior or regardless of what your income levels are, where it adds another choice. Like you have all these private insurers, or I could buy into Medicare. And given that the government does not have to make a profit, the premiums would be so much lower than what they would be in like a normal private marketplace. So that forces the private insurers to really keep their costs low in order to stay competitive with the public option. Now, there are some doomsayers who are pro private insurance that say that this would like tank the private insurance industry, but there are others that say that this would actually inject more fair competition into the marketplace while also expanding access. You could similarly look at some states that did a pretty good job with rolling out universal healthcare. So like Massachusetts, for instance, the Mass Health program, it auto enrolls people that make less than a certain income level into a public option. And as a result, the insured rate in Massachusetts is it's like 98%. And Mitt Romney signed that into law when he was the governor of Massachusetts, and he had to backpedal so hard in the 2012 presidential race when he was asked, like, well,
Well,
you
well, that
implemented
was the
universal
states
healthcare.
doing it instead of a federal plan. So that
Yeah,
was his justification. Yeah.
yeah.
But okay, so we have some options there that can definitely be added. But wouldn't that necessarily be a plan plus counter plan, right? You're functionally having a single payer option, but then you're also saying, we'll also let something else exist too.
I think you could say that it's like public-private multi-payer. Like that's why I would spin it as the neg. There's an interesting article by this guy, Jacob Hacker, and I think it's Medicare Part E. And this is his attempt to be like, I don't like single payer, but if you had this really high-powered public option, it would solve the access and issues and cost issues without being single payer. So it's like as close to single payer as you can get while maybe not being like full government control.
Gotcha. Well, I think we've given people some good things to think about the topic here. Uh, any final thoughts?
I think that debaters should like take this topic for like its simplicity in terms of the policy question and appreciate its creativity in terms of all the different ramifications that healthcare reform can have for so many different aspects of people's lives. Like I think in terms of the simplicity, it's like, okay, you know exactly what the resolution's asking you. So writing cases for and against should not be too tough. But then also some debaters might find it boring that it's like a straightforward resolution when in fact, like there are so many different avenues you could take, arguing for or against single payer. And like you can find that in the brief as well. And ultimately, there's just a lot of really great, like empirical oriented debates like to have about healthcare systems and philosophical debates, like with the K's and non-util stuff.
Yeah, and to kind of add on that, yes, it is a simple topic, but there really are real ramifications to these questions that are affecting everybody's lives. The other people in the round, your opponent, the judges, people watching, they may be dealing with, the healthcare system and the problems within it, and healthcare access and poor healthcare access, poor quality healthcare, all of these things. And so I would just want to say, as you go out and research these topics, we should be trying to maybe solve these problems on the F and the neg and not trying to deny that these problems exist, the existence of these problems, or deny even kind of a right to healthcare. I think that maybe those strategies can come across a little cold in the face of people dealing with these issues in their everyday life. But for all of us here at Champion Briefs, we wish you good luck on this topic. And for both myself and Adam, we thank you for watching.
Thank you so much.